In this example, I want to go through creating a LAMP stack, so Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, as inside of an EC2 instance. And then specifically, I want to install WordPress as an application inside of that EC2 instance, and some of the challenges and tips and tricks that you might use as you're working with a LAMP stack. So I'm going to go ahead and launch an instance. And I'm going to go ahead and find, I'm going to call this my LAMP stack. And I'm going to use Ubuntu as my Linux operating system. And I'm going to go with the free tier eligible instance type, so T2 micro. And then I'm going to go ahead and launch the instance. And it's going to ask me for a private key. So I'm going to create a new key pair. I'm just going to call this my Linux. I'll call it my LAMP key pair. And I'll create that and save it on my desktop. Okay, and then I should be able to launch the instance. Okay, and if I look at my instance states, you can see it's pending right now. I'm going to go ahead and click into that instance. It will give me this public IP address, and when I try to connect to it, I'm going to use this public DNS address as well as that key pair in order to connect to the instance through SSH. So in order to connect to it, I'm going to use SSH. So I'm going to open up a terminal window. So I'm going to launch my terminal window, and then I'm going to use the command SSH, and then I'm going to include my key pair. So I'm actually going to change my working directory to my desktop first, and then there's my key pair. And then I'm going to use SSH. I'm going to include the key pair, so the LAMP key pair. And I'm going to connect using the username Ubuntu and then that domain name that Amazon assigned to it. And I'm sure that I want to connect, and it looks like I have bad permissions on that key pair. So my key pair, if I look at the permissions for that key pair, if I do a ls-all, and I'm looking at that key pair, it looks like I can read and write. The group associated with that file can read, and then everyone else can read. So those permissions would be 644. I actually want to change that to 400. So I'm going to do a sudo chmod 400 for the LAMP key pair. And now if I look at the permissions, now you'll see that I can read. I'm the owner of the file, and no one else has access to it. Okay, so now I'm going to clear that and try to connect again. And now you'll see that I'm able to connect. I'm actually connected to that virtual server, that EC2 instance. If I refresh this, you'll see the EC2 instance looks like it's running now. So the instance state's running, and I'm connected to it through SSH. So the first thing I want to do is I want to install Apache. Okay, so to confirm that Apache is working, the idea would be I could go out to a browser and type in that domain name. So this EC2 instance domain name. And I should see the Apache splash screen, but right now I don't have a web server installed on this instance. So when I try to access that web server, obviously I'm going to get a timeout because there's no web server there to actually respond to my HTTP request that I'm making inside of a browser. So the first thing I want to do is I want to install Apache, and then I can get a response back from that request. So I'm going to do a sudo apt update. So I'm actually going to update my package manager, which is apt. That's not necessarily required, but I always like to do that on a fresh install of Ubuntu, just to make sure that my package manager is up to date, so it has all the latest and greatest packages. And then once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and install Apache. The command to install Apache is actually apt install Apache 2. Okay, that's the command that will do it. But if I try to run that command right now, I'm logged in as the Ubuntu user account, and this command is going to give me permission issues. So it's going to tell me, hey, I couldn't open a lock file, permission denied, and it wasn't able to do the things I needed to do. So I actually want to run that same command, but I want to do that as my administrative account. And in Linux, the administrative account is the sudo account. So I can just use sudo apt install Apache 2. Okay, and now it'll allow that process to actually happen. I'll be able to obtain a lock file, and the installation will go fairly smoothly. Okay, and you'll notice in the background, it tells me that the site can't be reached. So as I was trying to access this site using that DNS address, I wasn't able to. Now I should be able to. However, the way EC2 is set up is there's a firewall in place that's going to block access to that EC2 instance. So I actually have to, I believe it's in networking. And I'm wrong, it's not in networking, maybe it's in security. It looks like it is in security. You'll see the inbound rules. So right now it'll allow traffic on port 22 to access the server, and that's it. But if I'm running a web server, I'm really running HTTP and HTTPS traffic. So ports 80 and 443 are the ports that I want to allow inbound traffic to. Port 22 is open by default because that's the port for SSH. So Amazon knows that you're going to connect to this Linux instance through SSH, so they automatically open up port 22. But because I want to use this EC2 instance as a web server, I have to open up some additional ports. Specifically, I have to open up ports 80 and 443. So I'm going to do that by clicking on the security group, and then I can edit the inbound rules. So you can see that it's the SSH traffic on port 22, so that's already in place. What I want to do is I want to add two new rules. The first one being for HTTP traffic, and I want that to be able to come from anywhere. So that's the source IP. And then I want to add another rule for HTTPS. And we're not going to set up an SSL key, but I probably do want to open up that firewall rule anyway. And I'm going to go ahead and once I've done that, so I have the inbound rules set. So under the security groups, I've set those rules. I should be able to go back to my EC2 instances. And I should be able to see that under security. I should see the inbound rules. And now if I come back over to my browser and specifically that domain name, you'll see that I get the Apache default page. Okay, so as far as the LAMP stack goes, we have the Linux install. That was just from launching our Linux instance. So the L for our LAMP stack is taken care of. And now our Apache is installed for our LAMP stack. Okay, so we're able to confirm that Apache's working correctly and life's good there. Okay, so then if I jump back over to my terminal window, the next thing I want to do is I want to install MySQL. So I'm going to do a apt install of MySQL server. Okay, and again, I get an error message. It's telling me that I have a permission denied issue. So I could type out sudo apt install MySQL-server, but there is a shortcut. So I want to run that same command, but I want to run it as an administrator. So I want to use that sudo command. But if I use the exclamation point, what that means is run the previous command, so the apt install MySQL-server, run that previous command as an administrator. Okay, so now I'm going to run that previous command, and you'll notice that when I typed in the sudo exclamation point, down below it actually showed that command of me installing the MySQL server. I have to confirm that I want that additional disk space to be used, which is fine. Okay, so it looks like MySQL is up and running. So I want to connect to MySQL, and the way I'm going to do that is MySQL-u root with no password. And I'm just going to use an empty password. Oh, and I can't remember the default password. I'm just going to go ahead and pause the video for a Okay, so I just did a little bit of background research in terms of how to connect to the MySQL instance in Ubuntu 2020 in Ubuntu 22, and the way you're going to connect is you want to use the MySQL command. You want to pass in the username of root, and there is no password by default. So if I tried this, it'll actually fail. I actually have to run this command as an administrative account. Okay, and that'll allow me to connect to MySQL. Okay, and that's all fine and great. The one thing that I will say with this is ultimately with this installation, we want to install WordPress. And by installing WordPress, when we do the WordPress installation, it's not going to work with a Ubuntu root user account that doesn't have a password. So I'm going to run into issues there. So what I want to do is I want to actually change that password so that there is a password associated with the root user account. So what I'm going to do is if you can kind of see my Google search results here. So I want to update the password, and I'm just going to say alter the user root at localhost, and I'm going to change the password to new password. So I'm just copying and pasting that command. And I think what's going on there is I want to paste that in, but I think these quotation marks are the wrong quotation marks just because I copied and pasted them from that internet URL. So I'm going through and actually modifying these quotation marks so that they're not kind of pretty quotation marks from the web. Okay, and looks like I have an issue there. Alter user root at localhost. I think the reason why I'm having this issue is I'm logged into MySQL, but I haven't actually selected a database. So I can use the command show databases. And I believe the user table is in the MySQL table. So I'm going to use the MySQL table. So you can see that it says the database changed. And now I want to run that command again. I don't know why I can't use the up arrow there to go back through my history of commands, but I'm just changing those quotes again. And that doesn't look successful either. Okay, so paused and restarted again, and I was trying to modify the root user password, and after a little bit of Googling efforts, I determined that that was probably a bad course of action. So what the suggestion is to create a separate MySQL user account just for this purpose. So I'm going to create a user account. So I'm going to exit, or I'm going to connect to MySQL. So I'm going to log in with my root user account. So I'm going to do sudo mysql-u root, and right now there's no password. I'm going to use the MySQL database. So if I show my databases, there's the MySQL database. That's where kind of the user account information is located. So I'm going to use the MySQL database. And then I want to create a user account on localhost being this local machine, this Ubuntu machine. So I'm going to create a user. So user is the table name. And I'm going to call that user Brian. And then it's going to be at localhost, so on the local machine. And then identified by and then my password, which I'm just going to make password for the time being. Okay, so I create that user account, and that's great. But ultimately, that user account is going to need additional rights. I'm going to use that user account to actually manage MySQL. So if I scroll down in this document that I have here, I want to add privileges to that user account. And specifically, what I want to do is I want to make that user account an administrative account for MySQL. So I'm going to grant all on star.star to Brian at localhost with the grant option. Okay, so I'm going to jump back over to my terminal. I'm going to say grant all on star.star to Brian at localhost with the grant option. Okay, so then I've just granted permission to that user account. So what I can do now is I can exit, and I should be able to connect to MySQL with that user account now. So I should be able to say sudo MySQL-u Brian, and then I want to include the password -p where I enter the password of just password. And now I'm connected, and I can show my databases. Okay, and you'll see that I can see all of the databases. What I really want to do though is, since I know that I'm installing the LAMP stack so that I can ultimately install WordPress, what I want to do is I actually want to create a table for my WordPress instance. So I'm going to create a new, I said table, but I want to create a new database named MATC. Okay, and now if I show the databases, now you'll see MATCs there, and I can use that MATC database, and I can show the tables. And right now there are no tables. And the reason there's no tables, and the reason that's fine, is I will rely on WordPress to actually install those tables, or to create those tables and the corresponding schemas necessary for WordPress. Okay, so that's the database that I actually want to use to store my WordPress information. Okay, but at this point, again, kind of just to go back to our LAMP stack, we have a Linux instance. That Linux instance has Apache installed. And now, once we have Apache installed, we also have MySQL installed, and that seems to be working, and we verified that it's working, and we have a user account and a corresponding database for that user account. So we have the LAM portion of the LAMP stack, and now the last thing we need to do is we need to install PHP, okay, and kind of verify that that's working. Okay, so I'm going to exit out of MySQL. Okay, so I've exited out of MySQL, and I want to install PHP. So I think the latest and greatest version of PHP is PHP 8, but I'm not positive of that. So if I just do a sudo apt install of PHP, I think it'll just install the latest version of it. Okay, and it looks like it's grabbing PHP 8.1. Okay, and I want to see if I can actually have a PHP page show up and get rendered here. And I'm pretty confident that I will not be able to do that. In order to do that, I have to enable PHP, and by default, I don't think that that's actually done. So you'll notice that there's this Apache configuration. So the splash screen is telling me the different configurations that I have. And I don't have the mods enabled, so I don't have PHP enabled. I think I can just enable PHP. I think I can do a sudo a2 nmod PHP. So sudo, run the command as administrator, and then this is an Apache command, Apache 2 enable mod, and I just want to enable the mod PHP. And it looks like that module doesn't exist. I'm kind of surprised by that, but maybe not. So let's actually just try to create a PHP file and see if that will get rendered. I'm going to do that in the website root directory. So I'm going to do that in the var www html directory. And if I do a directory listing, you'll see this HTML file. This HTML file is actually this Apache splash screen. And I know that because it tells me that on the splash screen. Okay, I'm going to create an index.php file. Okay, and if I look at the permissions of this directory, this HTML directory, what it is it's basically saying the root user account has access to that directory. So I'm going to create a new file here, index.php, but I'm going to do that as the administrator so that I actually can do it. So if I tried to just say, hey, I want to create index.php, I'll get a permission denied error. But if I do that same thing as an administrator, it's still saying permissions denied. That's interesting. Let's try this a different way. So I want to do a sudo echo to index.php. Okay, and that allowed me to do it. So I'm not sure why. Actually, it looks like it was not successful. So it kind of looked like it was successful, but then if I do a directory listing, that index.php file is not actually getting created. Let's do it with Nano. So Nano is an inline text editor. I'm just going to create some PHP, echo hello world from PHP. And I'm going to try to write that out. Looks like that was successful. And now if I do a directory listing, now you'll see index.php exists. And what I can do is, this is index.html. So that's the Apache splash screen. But now I want to try to access the PHP file. And you'll notice that I'm getting this hello world message. It's not trying to download my PHP file, and it's not outputting the raw source code. It's actually executing that PHP code. So it looks like when I installed PHP with Apache, it enabled the PHP module, so it's actually serving up PHP just fine. Okay, so that looks to me like it's working. Okay, so at this point, I have the LAMP stack installed. So I have Linux, I have Apache, I have MySQL, I have PHP. I've verified that all of those things are working, and they're kind of working together. I think we'll find out that PHP is not able to connect to MySQL, and we'll see that error when we try to install WordPress. But we'll get that up and running in a second. What I want to do now, though, is I actually want to grab WordPress. Okay, so if I go out to my browser, there's wordpress.org, which will allow me to download it. And if I go to download WordPress, so you'll notice the URL is https wordpress.org/latest.zip. So I'm hovering over it, and then down in the bottom left in the status bar, right down here where my cursor is located, you'll see that URL show up. And the reason I'm saying that is because I don't have a web-based or a graphical browser on my Linux instance. Okay, so that's going to be an issue for me. So instead, what I want to do is I actually want to download it. I'm going to download it right here. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use wget. Okay, so again, the URL for WordPress is wordpress.org/latest.zip. So I'm going to use wget https wordpress.org and then latest.zip. Okay, and it tells me that it wasn't able to write. And the reason why is because I don't have permission. So I'm going to try to execute that same command as an administrator, and now you'll notice that it did download. And if I do a directory listing, here's latest.zip. And what I want to do is unzip latest.zip. Okay, so unzip isn't found, and it tells me that I can install it by installing unzip. So I'm going to do that. So I'll just install unzip. Okay, that looks okay to me. And what I want to do then is I want to unzip latest.zip. Okay, and when I unzip it, it's telling me I get permission denied errors. So I actually want to run the previous command as an administrator. And now if I do this directory listing, you'll see that there's this WordPress folder here. So that's what got extracted from latest.zip. So now I'm able to remove latest.zip. I'm also going to remove index.php. I would likely even remove WordPress, but I don't have to. I guess that's fine the way it's located. But at this point, all I have is the HTML file in WordPress. So now if I come out to my URL, instead of going to index.php, I'm going to go to WordPress. And it tells me, okay, so it knows that my PHP installation appears to be missing the MySQL extension, which is required by WordPress. Okay, please check that the MySQL extension is installed and enabled. Okay, so I'm going to go back over to my terminal. That's what I was saying, that I wouldn't be able to connect to MySQL from PHP. So I'm going to do a sudo apt install of php-mysql. Okay, and once I've done that, now I'm able to connect to MySQL from PHP, but my Apache web server doesn't know that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to restart Apache. So I'm going to say sudo service Apache 2 and then restart. So I just restarted Apache 2, and now I'm trying to access the same URL. I'm trying to go to my site and then that WordPress folder. Okay, so now it's saying, hey, I'm going to need some information. Welcome to WordPress. I'm going to need a database, a username, a password, a database host, and a table prefix. That looks fine to me. Okay, so I'm going to say, go ahead, let's go. Okay, so my database name is MATC. My username is Brian. My password is password. I can verify that. My database host is localhost. It's on my local machine. And then the table prefix, by default, they're going to use WP. I don't have to have a table prefix, but a lot of times I might have multiple WordPress installations on a single database. So I can, or I don't have to, but I'm going to go ahead and submit this. Okay, it doesn't like that password. Okay, so never. It tells me that it was unable to write this wp-config file, and it says that I can manually do that. Okay, so it's saying if I go ahead and manually do this, and it's basically capturing what database do I want to use, what's my username, what's my password. So it's capturing all those things. I'm going to copy that to my clipboard. And then that wp-config file is part of my WordPress install. So if I change my working directory to that WordPress folder and do a directory listing, you'll see the wp-config -sample.php. What it's saying is that I should have a wp-config.php file. Okay, and so there's two ways I can do it. I can move this config.sample, which is probably what I should do, or I can create a new file named wp-config.php. Either way is probably fine. I'm just going to move the wp config and my tab complete doesn't seem to be working. -sample.php. So I want to move that file to wp-config.php. Okay, and now if I do a directory listing, now you'll see that it's modified, and then I'm going to open it up with Nano. Okay, and then what I want to do is I want to I want to cut all of this. So I want to, I don't know that there's an easy way to cut all of this stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and exit. I'm actually going to remove wp-config. Okay, so I remove that file. Then I'm going to recreate it. And then I'll paste in the content from the web, okay, that has my information. I can write it out. Okay, so now that file's actually been modified. And then once that's done, I can run this installation. Okay, and it's asking for a site title. I'll call it Madison College. My username, I'm going to make Brian. My password, I'm actually not going to use a strong password. I'm going to make it password. I'm going to confirm that. And I'm going to go ahead and install WordPress. Okay, so I go ahead and confirm my weak password. I go through the WordPress installation. Okay, so it tells me that WordPress has been installed. Thank you and enjoy. I'm going to go ahead and log in. So Brian and password. I'm just verifying that that's the correct password. I can log in. Okay, this is the dashboard that I would use to work with WordPress. And then the actual site, if I take this URL, I'm just going to open up a new incognito window and launch that. Now you'll notice that I have this default sample page. So it has my page title. I'm not logged in right now, so that's why I'm not seeing the dashboard. Okay, so I can come over to the dashboard. I can also go over to the actual site. I can toggle between my administrative dashboard and the actual site. But you'll see this Howdy Brian, and that's because I'm logged in and I can toggle back and forth between the dashboard and my actual site. Okay, so WordPress is kind of a really powerful tool to build websites. I don't really want to get into too much WordPress, but we have a WordPress application built on top of our LAMP stack. I will say a couple of things about this. Okay, some gotchas. These are super important gotchas. So if you've made it this far, these are going to come back and maybe cause issues for us. So when I'm looking at this WordPress site, I have this domain name that Amazon assigned to me. And that domain name is associated with a specific IP address, right? So I have a public IP address. This instance, if I keep running, it'll continue to have that IP address, right? And I'm getting billed by the hour for this instance. Okay, so maybe I'm doing some development and I decide, hey, I don't want to do any development and I can have it up and running, but I want to take a break now and maybe I'm not going to come back to it for a month, so there's no need for me to actually pay for this web server. It's not a public site yet. I'm just kind of working on things. So I decide I actually want to take the instance state and I want to stop that instance. Okay, so no problem there. But when I'm working with WordPress, it does become a problem. And the reason I say that is because if I look, anything that I do in WordPress, from the install to adding new posts and pages and images and all of that stuff, anything I do in WordPress, it's going to be associated with this IP address or a domain name. And I'm not guaranteed to have the same IP address or domain name going forward. Okay, so what ends up happening is I actually get some MySQL records created that have a reference to this IP address in my WordPress database. Okay, and as soon as I stop and start my instance, that IP address theoretically could change. Okay, so if I stop my EC2 instance, my IP address is almost always going to change. So what I would suggest is that instead of having this public IP address causing issues with our WordPress instance, which it already will, so I've already went kind of down the rabbit hole of causing some issues. What I would suggest instead, though, is coming over to EC2, coming over to Elastic IPs, saying that I want to get a permanent Elastic IP. I believe an Elastic IP costs 50 cents a month. I'm not positive on the cost, but there is a cost associated with it. So I'm going to go ahead and allocate an Elastic IP. So now I have a public IP that I own. I'm going to pay for it every month. I can take this IP address and associate it with my instance. Okay, so with my instance, I can come through, I can go to networking, and this IP address, sorry, I'm doing it the wrong way. In Elastic IPs, I want to basically take this and I want to associate it. I want to associate that Elastic IP with my instance that's running. Okay, so now I have this Elastic IP, the 323.250.121. It's a public IP address. If I go look at my instance, that's going to be the IP that this is using. Okay. You'll notice the DNS actually changed as well. Okay, because that IP address is embedded in the public DNS address. Okay, so now if I look at my URL, I'm actually using the wrong URL at this point. But I should have done that before I did the WordPress install, and then that's going to allow me, as long as I keep that Elastic IP, then I can come to the instance and I can actually toggle the status. I can toggle the state, so I could stop it. And then instead of paying for my EC2 instance, kind of at an hourly rate, what I'm doing is I'm just paying that fixed fee of 50 cents a month to have that Elastic IP address, so that the next time, even after stopping it, that Elastic IP will be assigned to my EC2 instance. Okay, and that'll cause a lot of headache relief when you're working with WordPress, because now you have a permanent IP address assigned to your WordPress site, even if you don't have a domain name yet pointed at your WordPress site. Okay, so that's just one of the gotchas that you're going to run into with WordPress. If you don't want to get into the weeds of actually modifying your underlying database records, I'd highly suggest doing that before you do your WordPress install. Okay. So I'm going to stop here for this, and really the focus for this class is not on WordPress, but focused on EC2 and installing software and kind of working in Linux in that environment and getting that LAMP stack up and running inside of an EC2 instance.